Good morning, Westmead. How are we this morning? I'm sitting here in Manly and it's thundery and raining out there. The theme for this morning that I have chosen from our gospel reading is be aware of the dance of power, becoming slaves to love. Jesus is pretty upset in our reading for this week in Matthew 23, verses 1 to 13. And he becomes most woefully upset as the chapter continues. Jesus is upset because by looking, listening, and experiencing the struggles of people, he sees how Jewish leaders, the scribes and Pharisees, contribute to this suffering or do not act to support others as they need it. He uses strong language to describe their dominant dance of power over the whole of life, social, cultural, religious, and political. They sit on Moses' seat, Jesus says, which means they hold the highest authority. Their power is absolute. It affected every aspect of that society. It was all of life power. Moses presented the ancient Israelites with the commandments, but Moses also, with others, created hundreds of other guidelines for every aspect of their shared life together. Jesus shares with his listeners, the disciples and the crowds, that the scribes and Pharisees take advantage of sitting on Moses' seat and continue to create more guidelines, but this time based on their views and coming from their social, cultural, and economic positions. They are of a higher class. They use this power to create knowledge and influence how people living in poor socio-economic situations should live. For these leaders, this is, we know the truth. We know, and everybody should fit in. This is a control of power approach, not a shared equal power with others approach. Before this event, Jesus moved among villages and people, and he saw how people were burdened by the strict, unnecessary guidelines and rules which these leaders created. Jesus supported people. He challenged the burdensome rules because he sees what they produced: starvation, sickness, people becoming beggars, land taken by clever scribe lawyers, widows having homes taken from them. He sees how Pharisees created strict purity laws that were impossible for poor people to fulfill. And even more, that with good leadership, this poverty and hardship could have been prevented. It is not the fault of the poor and oppressed, it is the system and its poor leadership and lack of cooperation that creates injustice and poverty. Jesus sees this and he challenges it. In complete contrast, Jesus heartfully and compassionately says, "Come to me, all who labour and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Even more, Jesus sees how they use their positions and roles to gain power and honour for themselves and treat others as competition. Jesus further observes that they contradict the teaching of Moses by not practicing what they preach. They gain significant power and respect from society, and then they abuse this trust. Be aware of them, Jesus says in Mark's version. And in our common humanity, Jesus implies that we should be aware of how we contradict our values. Jesus looks even deeper into their desires and motivations. He says they do all their deeds to be seen, to be seen. They love to have places of honour at special events. They desire to be the greatest, Jesus says. Jesus makes these comments. We have to make sure we say this, but Jesus makes these comments not to ridicule the behaviour, as some Christians have interpreted, but with humility to understand and discern their dance of power. And we too are invited to learn and reflect on what causes this dance of power in this context and our own. Such desires to be seen, to be noticed and looked at, to hold places of honour, to be the greatest, were common in ancient societies. Honour was one of the most valued experiences, and because they were limited experiences, people aggressively and ruthlessly competed for them. So common was this desire for honour that in Mark chapter 9, verses 33 to 37, Jesus overhears his followers arguing, yes, guess what, about which of them was the greatest. And we can see by reading Matthew's Gospel deeply that this competition was common in Matthew's communities. Studies today have shown how these desires are expressed in daily interpersonal emotional dynamics. That means there are feelings between each other. We don't realise it, but we so want what the other is or has that we want to replace them with ourselves. In St. Augustine's Confessions, he reports seeing a little boy bitterly eyeing his baby brother at his mother's breast. What he wants is to be the figure of completion he sees before him. Envy focused on being, not having. Envy wants what the other is, not what the other has. The older brother wants to be the baby brother. To be the brother being fed by the mother becomes an ongoing, lifelong desire for this brother to find similar fulfillment and satisfaction in objects. The object of envy is more important than the person envied. The little brother doesn't exist. He needs to get out of the way so that the big brother can take over and enjoy what the little brother has. What Jesus is doing is sharing his critical observations of the use of power and sharing examples of the burdensome effects of such use of power on the whole of society. And this happens in all societies, and it happened with the followers of Jesus during his ministry. What does Jesus say to his disciples who practice a competitive dance of power as they argue about who is the greatest? Jesus informs them that whoever desires to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Through this story, we're invited to uncover our self-serving ways and to learn about our inner yearnings and desires as well. To have enough courage to see and accept our contradictions and to really live in the midst of life and taking the risk to share power equally, to see our class, economic, cultural differences. Jesus calls all who wish to follow him to live in an alternative reality. Whoever desires to be first must be last of all and servant of all. Servant of all. I suggest that this means being a slave to love. I don't know if any of you remember Brian Ferry's 1985, well actually it was an album, a single album, Slave to Love. And I don't mean to use his version of Slave to Love, which was a very romantic version, but to be a slave to love is to live love as a relationship and collaboration, working together, to have shared equal power with. It really is an impossible possibility, I know. It is such a radical way of being that it requires a courageous decision to be born again into it. And the term servant, Jesus often takes a term that people see around them in their society. There were servants and slaves everywhere in that ancient society. And so Jesus says, hey, be a slave to love, and turns the whole idea of love upside down. Servanthood has often been abused and misunderstood, and women are unfortunately have to be servants and men were to be the master. That is why love is the master, Jesus is suggesting. Love, not a person, is the master. For another person or a master may betray us. For Matthew, Jesus is about love of God and love of neighbour. To finish, let us daily take into our hearts and life together that the dance of power is about being slaves to love, about love as relationship and collaboration, working together, shared equal power with, which is our vision and mission in Parramatta Mission.